A glimmer of hope. The once thriving planet of Zithra lay in ruins. The aftermath of the war between humanity and the Naren Collective had left it a barren, desolate wasteland. Crumbling cities stretched out under a blood-red sky, the air thick with toxic fumes from the weapons that had been unleashed. For Dylan Carter, a retired human engineer, this was just another grim reminder of what humanity was capable of, both its triumphs and its tragedies. Dylan was alone on this forsaken world, scavenging for tech remnants. The war might have been over, but the cleanup was far from complete. He moved cautiously, his exosuit shielding him from the planet's hostile environment. His hand never strayed far from his sidearm. The Naren might have retreated, but danger still lurked in the form of rogue scavengers, malfunctioning defense systems, and the unpredictable terrain. His scanner beeped softly, indicating an unusual heat signature nearby. Frowning, Dylan adjusted the settings. This wasn't debris or equipment. It was something alive. Curiosity piqued, he followed the signal to a crumbling structure, half buried in the toxic sands. The metallic framework groaned under its own weight, but Dylan's instincts told him this was worth investigating. As he stepped inside, his boots crunched against shattered glass and twisted metal. The dim light of his helmet illuminated the room, revealing the source of the signal. Huddled in a corner were 5 small figures. Their pale, translucent skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and their large, reflective eyes turned toward him in fear. They were Naren children, abandoned and trembling. The oldest girl, who looked no older than 12 in human years, stepped forward cautiously. Her thin, frail body shook, but she held her chin high, trying to protect the others. "Please, don't hurt us," she said, her voice soft but laced with desperation. Dylan froze, his heart pounding. The Naren had been humanity's sworn enemies, but this was different. These weren't soldiers or combatants. They were children, scared, fragile, and utterly helpless. "What happened to you?" Dylan asked, his voice rough from disbelief. "They left us," the girl replied, her glowing eyes welling up with tears. "Our people said we were defective. Weak." Her words hit Dylan like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the other children. They were malnourished, their bodies too fragile for this environment. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, clung tightly to the girl's leg, his breathing shallow and labored. Dylan knelt down, lowering his weapon. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice steady. "I won't hurt you." The girl hesitated but finally nodded. She whispered something to the others in their language, and they began to relax, though fear still lingered in their wide eyes. Dylan's training and instincts screamed at him to walk away. His orders, long since retired, had been clear during the war: eliminate all Naren presence. Even though the conflict had ended, tensions remained high, and anyone aiding the enemy could be branded a traitor. But as he looked at the children, he couldn't bring himself to abandon them. His communicator crackled to life, startling the children. Dylan quickly silenced it, but not before hearing the voice of a nearby scavenger group. They were sweeping the area, likely drawn by the same signal he had followed. Dylan cursed under his breath. He had to move fast. "Listen to me," he said, looking at the oldest girl. "I'm going to get you out of here, but you have to trust me. Can you do that?" The girl nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Dylan wasted no time. He pulled out emergency blankets from his pack and wrapped them around the children, shielding them from the worst of the toxic air. He adjusted his suit's filters and cobbled together makeshift respirators from spare parts, ensuring they could breathe outside. "Stay close to me," he said firmly. "And don't make a sound." With the youngest child cradled in his arms and the others following close behind, Dylan led them out of the ruins. The alien wind howled around them, carrying a mix of ash and fine sand that scratched against his visor. His scanner beeped again, warning of the approaching scavengers. They were getting closer. Dylan pushed forward, his mind racing. He knew a safe zone was a mile away, a hidden alcove he had discovered during previous runs. It wasn't much, but it would buy them time to figure out their next move. The journey was grueling. The children stumbled over the uneven terrain, their frail bodies struggling to keep up. Dylan carried the youngest boy, whose breathing had become worryingly faint. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning for any sign of pursuit. When they finally reached the alcove, Dylan ushered the children inside. He adjusted the blankets and respirators, ensuring they were stable before collapsing against the wall, exhausted. The oldest girl approached him, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her glowing eyes studying him intently. Dylan hesitated. "Because, it's the right thing to do." The girl's expression softened. "My name is Ziri," she said quietly. "Thank you, for not leaving us." Dylan nodded, his resolve hardening. The war had taken enough from both their species. He wasn't about to let it claim the lives of innocent children too. As the wind howled outside, Dylan began to formulate a plan. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, for himself, and maybe for humanity. The wind howled fiercely as Dylan crouched in the alcove, his breathing heavy and his mind racing. The 5 Naren children huddled together, their translucent skin catching the faint glow of the emergency lamp he had placed in the center of the shelter. Ziri, the eldest, sat closest to the others, her sharp gaze never leaving him. Though she was just a child, there was a maturity in her expression that spoke volumes about what she had endured. Dylan wanted to reassure her, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The youngest boy, whose name he learned was Kale, had been struggling to breathe since they left the ruins. His small body trembled in Dylan's arms, and his shallow breaths came in uneven bursts. Dylan quickly rummaged through his kit, cobbling together a crude respirator using salvaged parts from his own gear. He carefully placed it over Kale's face, holding his breath as he waited for a sign that it was working. A soft wheeze turned into a steadier rhythm, and Dylan let out a sigh of relief. Ziri watched closely, her voice breaking the silence. "You could have left us. Why didn't you?" Dylan met her gaze, his voice steady but laced with weariness. "Because leaving you would have been wrong. I've seen enough destruction. I couldn't add to it." The girl nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "Humans fought us," she said after a pause. "They said we were monsters." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He didn't have the heart to tell her that, during the war, he believed the same. But sitting there, looking at these frightened, abandoned children, he knew how wrong he had been. They weren't monsters. They were victims, just like so many humans had been. The faint crackle of his communicator shattered the quiet. Dylan stiffened, quickly lowering the volume before the children could hear. A familiar voice came through the static, cold and gruff. "Carter, we know you're out there. Don't do anything stupid." It was Harris, a captain he had worked with during the war. Dylan's stomach churned. If Harris and his squad were nearby, they wouldn't hesitate to finish what the war had started. He couldn't let them find the children. Ziri noticed the change in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not safe yet," Dylan admitted. "There are people looking for us, and they won't stop until they find what they're after." Ziri's eyes widened, and she glanced at the younger children, who were already struggling to recover from their ordeal. Dylan could see the fear returning to her face, but she held herself steady, as if trying to appear strong for the others. Dylan stood and checked the perimeter of the alcove, peering out into the wasteland. The faint glow of headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter with each passing moment. His heart sank. The scavengers were closing in faster than he had anticipated. They had likely picked up the heat signatures of the children or the faint signals from the old alien tech Dylan was using. Either way, they wouldn't stop until they found him. Dylan turned back to Ziri. "We need to move. Can you carry the younger ones?" "I'll try," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He knelt beside her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Stick close to me. No matter what happens, don't stop moving." The group set out into the night, the toxic winds biting against their makeshift respirators. Dylan carried Kale while Ziri helped another younger girl, whose steps were unsteady. The terrain grew rougher, the jagged rocks and loose sand threatening to trip them with every step. Dylan pushed forward, his military training kicking in as he scanned the landscape for any sign of a safer path. The headlights grew brighter, and the low hum of engines began to fill the air. Dylan's pulse quickened. They were running out of time. He spotted an outcropping of rocks ahead, large enough to provide temporary cover. Motioning for the children to follow, he led them to the shelter, crouching low as the scavengers' vehicles came into view. The lead vehicle came to a stop, and a group of armed men stepped out. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, barked orders to his crew. "Spread out. The heat signature came from this area. Whatever it is, it's valuable." Dylan gritted his teeth. He recognized the man, Rogan, a notorious scavenger who had made a name for himself during the war by looting alien colonies. Rogan's reputation was ruthless, and Dylan knew there was no reasoning with him. The only option was to avoid detection or fight their way out, and the latter wasn't a risk Dylan was willing to take with the children. As the scavengers moved closer, Dylan carefully set Kale down behind a rock and whispered to Ziri, "Stay hidden. No matter what happens, don't come out until I say." Ziri nodded, her grip tightening around the younger girl she was holding. Dylan rose to his feet, moving silently to position himself between the scavengers and the children. He pulled out a small device from his pack, a makeshift EMP he had built from the remnants of alien tech. It wouldn't stop the scavengers for long, but it might give them a chance to escape. He waited until Rogan was close, then triggered the device. A sharp crack echoed through the air as the EMP discharged, disabling the scavengers' vehicles and equipment. Shouts of confusion erupted as the men scrambled to figure out what had happened. Dylan didn't waste a second. He grabbed Kale and signaled to Ziri. "Run. Now." The group sprinted through the darkness, the sound of the scavengers' angry shouts fading behind them. Dylan's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep going, every step fueled by the determination to keep the children safe. They didn't stop until the faint glow of another ruin appeared on the horizon. As they reached the safety of the structure, Dylan collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. The children gathered around him, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Ziri knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "Thank you. You saved us." Dylan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the scavengers had been. This was only the beginning. There was still so much danger ahead, but for now, they had survived. And that was enough to give him hope. The ruins offered only a brief respite. The structure Dylan had led the children to was little more than a crumbling shell, its walls riddled with holes and its supports threatening to collapse under the strain of the planet's harsh winds. Still, it gave them a chance to catch their breath, and for Dylan to assess their next move. The scavengers were likely regrouping, and it wouldn't take them long to pick up the trail again. Kale, the youngest, was resting against Ziri's side. His breathing was steadier now, but his body remained weak. Dylan worked quickly, scavenging through the remnants of the building for anything that could help. He found a broken Naren console buried under debris and began prying it open, his hands moving with practiced precision. Ziri watched him intently, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Building a distraction," Dylan replied, not looking up. He pulled a circuit board from the console and began rewiring it with pieces from his toolkit. "If the scavengers come back, this will buy us time to escape." Ziri hesitated before speaking again. "Why do you know how to do all this? You're not a soldier." Dylan paused for a moment, glancing at her. "I used to be," he admitted. But I'm an engineer first. I built things before the war, things that helped people. Then everything changed, and I started tearing things apart instead. Now I'm just trying to fix what I can. Ziri nodded, her large, luminous eyes reflecting both understanding and sadness. Our people, we don't fix things like you do. If something is broken, we leave it behind. Her words hung in the air, and Dylan could see the pain in her expression. It wasn't just the war that had scarred her, it was the knowledge that her own kind had abandoned her and the others. Dylan felt a pang of anger at the Naren for their cruelty but pushed it aside. Dwelling on it wouldn't help them now. With the makeshift device complete, Dylan turned his attention back to the children. We need to keep moving, he said, his tone firm but gentle. There's an old atmospheric processor about 3 miles from here. If it's still working, it could give us clean air and a place to hide. The children exchanged nervous glances. Ziri nodded, though her small frame seemed to sag under the weight of exhaustion. We'll follow you, she said. Dylan hoisted Kale into his arms, his muscles already aching from the weight of carrying the boy for so long. The others gathered close, their movements sluggish but determined. Together, they ventured back into the wasteland. The journey was brutal. The terrain grew more treacherous with every step, the jagged rocks and loose sand giving way to stretches of cracked earth that seemed ready to collapse beneath their feet. The toxic wind howled, carrying with it particles that scratched against Dylan's visor and stung the children's exposed skin. Dylan pushed himself forward, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the processor. His military training kept him alert, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. The scavengers could appear at any moment, and Dylan knew they wouldn't hesitate to use force if they caught up. As they crested a ridge, Dylan's heart sank. The processor was in sight, but it was surrounded by debris from the war, a minefield of unexploded ordnance and collapsed structures. Getting through would be dangerous, but they didn't have a choice. He crouched down, setting Kale on the ground and turning to the others. Listen to me, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. This next part is going to be tricky. You need to follow exactly where I step. Don't move until I tell you. Understand? The children nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Dylan led the way, his movements slow and deliberate. Each step was calculated, his eyes scanning for any sign of instability in the ground. The children followed in single file, their breaths shallow and nervous. Halfway through, Dylan heard a faint click beneath his foot. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he glanced down and saw the edge of a pressure plate poking through the sand. A landmine. He raised his hand, signaling the children to stop. Ziri's voice was barely a whisper. What is it? Stay where you are, Dylan replied, his voice calm but firm. He adjusted his weight, carefully stepping off the plate without triggering it. The mine remained undisturbed, and Dylan let out a silent breath of relief. The rest of the journey to the processor was agonizingly slow, but they made it without incident. The children collapsed to the ground, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Dylan immediately began inspecting the processor. It was an old Naren design, its structure battered but intact. He climbed onto the platform, prying open a maintenance panel and pulling out a series of wires. Can you fix it? Ziri asked, her voice faint. Dylan nodded, though his focus remained on the machine. I'll make it work, he said. Just give me time. The processor hummed faintly as Dylan worked, his hands moving with precision. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool air circulating through his suit. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, the machine roared to life. Clean air began to flow through the vents, and Dylan adjusted the output to fill the area around them. The children breathed deeply, their relief palpable. Dylan slumped against the side of the processor, his energy nearly spent. Ziri approached him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. You saved us again, she said softly. Dylan shook his head. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "We've got a long way to go." As he spoke, a distant rumble reached his ears. Dylan's stomach dropped. It was the sound of engines, scavengers, or worse, the military. He stood, his exhaustion forgotten. They had been found. The children's safety depended on what he did next. Dylan's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them. Not while he still had strength left to fight. The engines roared louder with every passing second, a grim reminder that their brief reprieve had come to an end. Dylan stood rigid, his mind racing through every possible option. The children were too weak to run again, and the surrounding terrain offered no escape routes that wouldn't lead them straight into more danger. The atmospheric processor offered clean air but no real protection. He had to act quickly. "Stay here," Dylan instructed Ziri, his voice calm but firm. "Keep everyone close to the processor. No matter what happens, don't move until I come back." Ziri nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered. Dylan checked his sidearm, ensuring it was loaded and ready. He didn't have much ammunition left, and he knew he couldn't rely on brute force to solve this. He needed a plan, something that would buy the children enough time to escape if things went wrong. He moved quickly, keeping low as he left the safety of the processor's radius. The source of the noise came into view, a convoy of 3 vehicles, each one heavily armored and bristling with weaponry. Dylan recognized the lead vehicle immediately. It bore the insignia of Captain Harris, the very man who had contacted him earlier. This wasn't just a scavenger crew. It was a military patrol. Dylan's heart sank. Harris was no scavenger looking for loot, he was hunting for enemies of humanity. To Harris, the Naren children weren't innocent lives in need of saving. They were a loose end, a threat to Earth's fragile peace. Dylan crouched behind a jagged rock formation, watching as the convoy came to a halt. Soldiers poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn. Harris emerged last, his imposing figure unmistakable even from a distance. He barked orders, his voice carrying over the wind. "Spread out and secure the area. The heat signature came from this direction. Whatever it is, I want it found." Dylan clenched his fists. Harris wasn't the type to leave without finding what he was after. He needed a way to draw the soldiers away from the processor, but he couldn't risk leading them directly to the children. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His gaze fell on a cluster of unexploded ordnance scattered across the rocky terrain. Leftovers from the war, the devices were volatile and unpredictable, but they might be exactly what he needed. Dylan crept closer, careful not to draw attention to himself. He set to work, rigging the explosives into a chain reaction that would create a massive diversion. The soldiers moved closer, their boots crunching against the rocky ground. Dylan's hands worked faster, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool air. He glanced over his shoulder, calculating the distance. Harris and his men were dangerously close now. With a final twist of the wires, Dylan armed the explosives. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was a gamble, one misstep and the entire area could be reduced to rubble. But he had no other choice. He triggered the first explosive and dove for cover as a deafening blast shook the ground. A plume of dust and debris shot into the air, obscuring the soldiers' view. Shouts of confusion erupted as Harris's men scrambled to respond. Dylan used the chaos to slip away, staying low as he made his way back toward the processor. The children were where he had left them, their wide eyes fixed on him as he emerged from the dust cloud. Ziri rushed to his side, her voice trembling. "What happened? Are they gone?" "Not yet," Dylan replied, his breathing heavy. "But they're distracted. We need to move now." He hoisted Kale into his arms, motioning for the others to follow. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't stop." The group set off, their movements hurried but cautious. Dylan led them away from the processor, knowing that Harris's men would eventually realize they had been tricked. His only goal was to put as much distance as possible between the children and the patrol. The terrain grew more treacherous as they moved deeper into the wasteland. The ground was uneven, littered with debris and hidden pitfalls. Dylan's muscles ached from carrying Cale, but he pushed forward, his determination unwavering. Every step brought them closer to safety, or so he hoped. As they crested a ridge, Dylan spotted a small cave nestled into the side of a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter while they regrouped. He led the children inside, setting Cale down gently before collapsing against the wall. The adrenaline that had kept him going was beginning to wear off, replaced by the sharp sting of exhaustion. Ziri knelt beside him, her expression filled with worry. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Dylan lied, though his body begged for rest. "We're safe for now." But even as he said the words, he knew they were temporary. Harris wouldn't stop hunting them, and the scavengers were still out there somewhere. The children needed more than just a temporary refuge. They needed a way off the planet, a permanent solution to their plight. Ziri sat silently for a moment before speaking. "Why are you doing this for us? You don't even know us." Dylan looked at her, his expression softening. "Because someone has to. If we give up on helping each other, what's the point of any of this?" Ziri nodded, her gaze steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. Dylan could see the beginnings of trust forming, a fragile bond forged in the midst of chaos. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. As the children rested, Dylan began to plan his next move. He knew the only way to ensure their survival was to find someone who could help them escape the planet. But in a galaxy still recovering from war, allies were few and far between. He would have to rely on his skills, his determination, and a bit of luck. For now, though, all he could do was wait and hope that the cave would remain hidden from those who sought to destroy the lives he was trying so desperately to protect. The cave was silent except for the faint, labored breaths of the children and the distant howl of the alien wind. Dylan sat near the entrance, his back pressed against the cold stone, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The diversion had bought them time, but it wouldn't last. Harris and his men would regroup, and when they did, they would be relentless. Cale stirred weakly in Ziri's lap, his translucent skin glimmering faintly in the dim light of the emergency lamp. The boy's breathing was shallow, and Dylan could see the strain in Ziri's face as she gently stroked his hair. The others huddled close together, their wide, reflective eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Dylan's chest tightened. He had to get them to safety soon. He turned his attention back to the communicator strapped to his wrist. It was a risky move, but he had no choice. He adjusted the frequency, bypassing the standard military channels and tapping into an encrypted line. After a few tense moments, a familiar voice crackled through the static. "Carter, you better have a damn good reason for calling me." The voice belonged to Tessa Rain, a rogue pilot Dylan had worked with during the war. She was resourceful, skilled, and, most importantly, not bound by Earth's military command. "Tessa," Dylan said, keeping his voice low. "I need an extraction. 5 passengers. Non-human." There was a pause on the other end. "Non-human? You've got to be kidding me. Do you know how much heat that'll bring?" "I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't life or death," Dylan replied. "They're children, Tessa. They didn't ask for this." Another pause, longer this time. Finally, Tessa sighed. "You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." "Fine. But it's going to cost you." "Name your price," Dylan said, his tone resolute. "Your entire stash of refined ore," Tessa replied without hesitation. "And you owe me one." Dylan grimaced. The ore was the only thing of real value he had left, but it didn't matter. "Deal. How soon can you get here?" "Give me 3 hours. Send me your coordinates. Dylan ended the transmission, relief washing over him. They had a way out, if they could hold out long enough. Ziri approached him, her expression wary. What did you do? I called someone I trust, Dylan said. She's going to help us get off this planet. Ziri's eyes narrowed slightly. How do you know she won't betray us? I don't, Dylan admitted. But I've known Tessa for years. She's not the type to backstab anyone. If she says she'll help, she will. Ziri nodded slowly, though the doubt didn't entirely leave her face. Dylan couldn't blame her. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. The next few hours were agonizing. Dylan kept watch near the entrance, his sidearm resting on his knee. The children huddled together, their fragile bodies shivering despite the cave's relative warmth. He knew their survival depended on staying hidden, but every creak of the rock, every gust of wind, set his nerves on edge. When the distant hum of engines reached his ears, Dylan's stomach dropped. He crept to the edge of the cave, peering out into the wasteland. A single vehicle approached, its sleek, low profile marking it as Tessa's ship. Relief was short-lived, however, as another sound reached him, a second set of engines, coming from the opposite direction. Harris. Dylan's mind raced. Tessa would be landing in the open, vulnerable to an ambush. He couldn't let that happen. He turned back to Ziri, his expression grim. Stay here, he said. Keep everyone quiet. I'll be back. No, Ziri said, standing up. You can't go alone. I don't have a choice, Dylan replied. If Harris gets to that ship before we do, we're done. You need to keep the others safe. Ziri hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Dylan gave her a small, reassuring smile before slipping out of the cave. The wasteland stretched before him, illuminated by the faint glow of Tessa's descending ship. He moved quickly but carefully, staying low as he navigated the uneven terrain. The military patrol was closing in fast. Dylan could see their headlights bouncing across the rocks, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust. He reached the landing site just as Tessa's ship touched down, its hatch hissing open. Tessa emerged, her short-cropped hair glinting under the alien sun. You've got a lot of nerve, Carter, she said, her tone teasing despite the tension in the air. Less talk, more action, Dylan shot back. We've got company. Tessa's gaze shifted to the approaching vehicles, and she cursed under her breath. How many? Too many, Dylan replied. But we don't need to fight them. Just get the ship ready. I'll buy you some time. Tessa hesitated, then nodded. You've got 5 minutes, Carter. Don't push it. Dylan moved to intercept the patrol, his mind racing. He needed a distraction, something big enough to draw their attention away from the ship. He spotted a ridge overlooking the vehicle's path and climbed to the top, pulling out the last of his makeshift explosives. As the patrol approached, Dylan triggered the devices, sending a cascade of debris tumbling down the slope. The soldiers shouted in alarm, their vehicles screeching to a halt. Dylan fired a few shots, forcing them to take cover. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Carter. Tessa's voice crackled through his communicator. We're ready to go. Get back here. Dylan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted back toward the ship, his lungs burning with the effort. He reached the hatch just as it began to close, diving inside as Tessa lifted off. The ship's engines roared, propelling them into the sky and leaving Harris and his men far behind. Dylan collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving. The children stared at him, their wide eyes filled with a mix of awe and relief. Kale, still cradled in Ziri's arms, managed a weak smile. We're safe, Ziri whispered, her voice trembling. Dylan nodded, his exhaustion giving way to a faint smile. For now, he said. But we've still got a long way to go. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air as Tessa guided it through the turbulent atmosphere of Zithra. Dylan sat against the cold metal wall of the cargo bay, his body aching from the day's ordeal. The 5 Naren children huddled nearby, their translucent skin faintly reflecting the dim lights overhead. Kale had finally fallen into a restless sleep in Ziri's lap, his small body still weak but stable. Tessa entered the cargo bay, her sharp eyes scanning the group before settling on Dylan. "Well, Carter, I've got to hand it to you. You always find a way to make things complicated." Dylan let out a tired chuckle. "Complicated's my specialty." Tessa crouched beside him, her expression softening. "We've cleared the atmosphere. No sign of pursuit, at least for now. But you've got bigger problems. Where do you plan on taking them?" That was the question Dylan had been avoiding since the beginning. Getting the children off the planet was only the first step. Finding a place where they could be safe, truly safe, was another matter entirely. The Naren wouldn't take them back, not after deeming them defective. And Earth? The thought of turning them over to human authorities sent a chill down Dylan's spine. "There's an old research station on the outskirts of the Vega system," Dylan said finally. "It's abandoned now, but it has the facilities we need to take care of them. If we can get there, we'll be safe." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "The Vega system? That's deep in unregulated space. Lots of pirates, mercenaries, and other unsavory types." "Exactly," Dylan replied. "It's the last place anyone would think to look for us." Tessa sighed, standing and crossing her arms. "All right. But if this blows up in our faces, don't say I didn't warn you." As Tessa returned to the cockpit, Dylan turned his attention back to the children. Ziri was watching him closely, her expression unreadable. "You're risking a lot for us," she said softly. "It's worth it," Dylan replied without hesitation. "No one deserves to be abandoned. Not like this." Ziri looked down at Kale, her hand gently brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I didn't think humans could care about us like you do. During the war, all we saw were soldiers." Dylan's jaw tightened. "War makes monsters out of all of us," he said quietly. "But it doesn't have to define who we are." The ship lurched slightly, jolting them all. Tessa's voice crackled over the intercom. "Brace yourselves. We've got company." Dylan jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "Pirates," Tessa replied. "A small frigate just dropped out of hyperspace and is heading straight for us. They've got weapons locked." Dylan cursed under his breath. "How long until we reach the Vega system?" "Too long," Tessa said. "We're going to have to fight our way out." Dylan glanced at the children, their frightened faces staring up at him. He turned back to the intercom. "Do we have any defenses?" "Minimal," Tessa said. "This isn't a warship, Carter. It's a smuggler's rig. I can outmaneuver them for a while, but if they get a good shot, we're done." Dylan's mind raced. He couldn't let the pirates get anywhere near the children. "I'm coming to the cockpit," he said, heading toward the door. When he reached the cockpit, Tessa was already at the controls, her hands flying over the console. The frigate loomed on the view screen, its weapons glowing ominously. Dylan took the co-pilot's seat, scanning the controls for anything that could give them an edge. "We've got a few pulse mines in the cargo hold," Tessa said. "But deploying them manually is risky. One wrong move, and they'll blast us to pieces." "I'll do it," Dylan said without hesitation. Tessa gave him a sharp look. "Are you insane? You'll be exposed out there." "They won't get a clear shot if you keep us moving," Dylan said. "Just give me the signal when you're ready." Tessa hesitated, then nodded. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." Dylan rushed to the cargo bay, grabbing the pulse mines and securing them to a harness. He opened the airlock, the force field flickering as it struggled to keep the pressurized cabin intact. The cold void of space stretched out before him, the pirate frigate growing larger in the distance. Tessa's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Now, Carter. Deploy the mines." Dylan stepped onto the exterior hull, his boots magnetized to the metal surface. The frigate's weapons lit up, firing volleys of energy blasts that narrowly missed the ship. Dylan moved quickly, planting the mines along the hull's underside. Each step felt like an eternity, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he worked. The frigate fired again, the blast rocking the ship and nearly throwing Dylan off balance. He gritted his teeth, securing the last mine before sprinting back to the airlock. "It's done," he shouted. Tessa's voice came back, urgent. "Hold on to something." The pulse mines detonated, sending a shockwave rippling through space. The frigate's systems shorted out, its engine sputtering as it lost power. Tessa didn't wait to see the aftermath. She fired up the ship's hyperdrive, and they vanished into the void. Dylan collapsed onto the floor of the cargo bay, his chest heaving. The children ran to him, their wide eyes filled with concern. Ziri knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Dylan said, forcing a smile. "We're all fine." The ship stabilized as they entered the Vega system. Tessa's voice came through the intercom, calm but firm. "We're in the clear. The research station's coordinates are locked. We'll be there in a few hours." Dylan leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. The danger wasn't over, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of hope. The children were safe, at least for now, and he was determined to keep it that way. No matter the cost. The ship glided smoothly into the Vega system, the dark expanse of space punctuated by distant stars. The children had finally fallen asleep in a makeshift corner of the cargo bay, their frail bodies wrapped in emergency blankets. Dylan sat nearby, his back against the cold wall, his gaze fixed on the faint glow of the control panel. He knew the momentary peace wouldn't last. Tessa's voice crackled through the intercom. "We're approaching the research station. Looks intact, but I'm not picking up any life signs. Looks like your gamble might have paid off." Dylan exhaled, relief mingling with tension. "Bring us in, Tessa. Let's hope it has what we need." The station came into view, a massive, weathered structure orbiting a desolate moon. Its once polished surface was now scarred with the wear of decades. As Tessa guided the ship to dock, Dylan rose, checking his gear. Ziri appeared at his side, her expression wary. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "We go inside, secure the station, and see if it has the supplies we need," Dylan replied. "Stay close to me, and don't touch anything unless I say." The docking clamps locked into place with a metallic groan. Dylan led the way, his sidearm drawn as the airlock hissed open. The station's interior was dark and cold, the only light coming from dim emergency panels lining the walls. Dust floated in the still air, a sign that no one had set foot here in years. Tessa followed, carrying a small case of diagnostic tools. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered. "Better hope the power core is still functional, or we'll have hauled all the way here for nothing." Dylan nodded, his focus on the flickering control panels ahead. "Let's split up. You head to the core and see if you can bring the main systems online. I'll secure the med bay and check for supplies." Tessa gave a mock salute. "On it, boss." Dylan turned to Ziri. "Stay with the others in the docking bay. It's safer there." Ziri's expression hardened. "I want to help." Dylan hesitated but saw the determination in her glowing eyes. He nodded reluctantly. "All right. Stay close." The two moved cautiously through the station, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Dylan's flashlight scanned the walls, illuminating faded insignias and old equipment. The station had been a joint venture between humans and Naren, an effort to study biological compatibility between their species. It was ironic, Dylan thought, that a place built for collaboration had been abandoned in the wake of war. They reached the med bay, and Dylan's heart sank. Much of the equipment was damaged or missing, likely scavenged long ago. Still, he began searching the cabinets and drawers, pulling out anything that could be useful. Ziri stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What's all this for?" she asked, watching as Dylan examined a vial of alien medicine. "It's for you and the others," Dylan said. "To help with your breathing, your strength, everything the war took from you." Ziri tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "You risked so much for us." "Why?" Dylan paused, meeting her gaze. "Because someone has to. You're just kids, Ziri. You didn't deserve what happened to you. And if humanity is going to have any chance of redemption, it starts with us doing better." Her glowing eyes shimmered, and for the first time, Dylan saw a flicker of hope in her expression. "Thank you," she said softly. Before Dylan could respond, the station shuddered violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. His communicator crackled to life, Tessa's voice urgent. "Carter, we've got a problem. A big one." "What's going on?" Dylan asked, already moving back toward the docking bay. "Looks like someone else had their eyes on this place," Tessa replied. "I'm picking up a ship on the perimeter, military class. I don't think they're here for a friendly visit." Dylan cursed under his breath. "How long until they dock?" 10 minutes, maybe less. I've locked the main hatch, but that won't hold them for long." Dylan's mind raced as he reached the docking bay. The children were awake now, their frightened faces illuminated by the red emergency lights. Ziri ran to him, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" "We've got company," Dylan said, his tone grim. "But we're not going down without a fight." Tessa appeared, a scowl on her face. "We can't win this one, Carter. They've got firepower we can't match. If they get inside, we're done." Dylan paced, his thoughts moving a mile a minute. He glanced at the station's control panel, an idea forming. "What if we don't let them get inside?" Tessa frowned. "What are you talking about?" "We can rig the station's power core to overload," Dylan explained. "It'll create a chain reaction big enough to destroy the station, and their ship with it." Tessa's eyes widened. "That's insane. We're still on the station." Dylan nodded. "Which is why we set it on a timer. We'll take the kids and evacuate before it blows." Tessa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You always did like dramatic exits." They sprang into action. While Tessa worked on overloading the core, Dylan led Ziri and the others back to the ship. He moved quickly, carrying Kale and guiding the others as the station shook from the approaching ship's attempts to breach the hatch. As they reached the ship, Ziri stopped, her eyes wide. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll be right behind you," Dylan promised. "Get on board. Tessa and I will finish this." Ziri hesitated but nodded, leading the others onto the ship. Dylan turned and sprinted back to the core, where Tessa was finishing the final adjustments. 3 minutes, she said, slamming the panel shut. "Let's move." The two raced back to the ship as the station groaned under the strain of the approaching ship's assault. They barely made it aboard before Tessa fired up the engines, the docking clamps releasing just as the station's core began to overload. The ship shot away, the glow of the explosion growing behind them. Dylan watched from the viewport as the station erupted in a brilliant flash, taking the enemy ship with it. The children cheered softly, their relief palpable. Tessa slumped in her seat, exhausted but smiling. "Well, Carter, looks like you pulled it off again." Dylan leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "Let's just hope it's the last time." As the ship entered hyperspace, Dylan sat with the children, their small hands clutching his. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that they were safe, and that maybe, just maybe, he had given them a chance at a better future.